Henry VI was King of England for 39 years, from 1422 to 1461, and then again for 6 months from October 1470 to April 1471. Although he's the 11th Plantagenet to have sat on England's throne, he's commonly referred to as a Lancastrian king because it was under his reign that the Wars of the Roses broke out between two separate branches of the royal family stretching back to Edward III. On the one side, the House of Lancaster descended from Edward III's son, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. On the other, the House of York, descended from Edward III's other son, Edmund, the Duke of York. Henry VI is famous for inheriting the crown of England when he was just 9 months old, and for suffering such severe mental health issues as an adult, the kingdom toppled around him. He's also, arguably, the only one of our kings who simultaneously ruled England and France. He's a pivotal monarch, beginning his reign when he could barely walk, realising the dream of many previous kings by sitting on the French throne, but then losing it all. His life snuffed out with a blow to the head when he was 49. On top of that, the chaos of Henry VI's reign would result in an unexpected turn in English history. Just 14 years after his death, a distant branch of the royal family would sweep to power and come to dominate the history books, the Tudors. Let's have a quick look at where he sits in our kings and queens timeline. He's here, his reign ending around 550 years ago. By the time he was born in 1421, his father, Henry V, had basically conquered France, forcing the French king, Charles VI, to agree to allowing him to inherit the French throne. Sadly for him, Henry V died just weeks before Charles VI. The baby Henry inherited the two thrones. When he was 7 years old, he was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. 2 years later, he was crowned King of France in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Charles VI and Henry V may have had an agreement while they were alive, but once both men were dead, Charles's son unsurprisingly decided he still wanted the inheritance his father had given away. Charles VII set about harrying the English armies that had occupied France. Not only that, he apparently had divine support too in the form of Joan of Arc, who claimed God had told her to go and fight the English forces. Despite being a young peasant girl with no military training whatsoever, Joan relieved the French from the siege of Orleans and led a successful fight back. After years of English dominance, English forces were on the back foot. Though they eventually captured Joan and burned her at the stake in Rouen in 1431, when Henry VI was 9, the English started to lose ground. As the years progressed and Henry VI matured from a child to a man, these losses continued. Matters weren't helped by Henry's nature. In contrast to his father, who had waged a constant, unrelenting war against the French, Henry favoured peace and surrounded himself with advisors such as the Duke of Suffolk, who felt the same way. In a bid to stem the tide, the 24-year-old king took a wife in 1445. His rival king's niece, Margaret of Anjou. Disastrously, though, part of the settlement involved him ceding Maine to Charles VII. Even conceding some territory in a bid for peace didn't help. Charles VII wanted the whole of France, and so the military defeats continued. So much so that the history books refer to Charles VII as Charles the Victorious. Eventually, Rouen and Normandy, the centre of the English crown in France, fell to the French king. Older English nobles who had fought alongside Henry V for these territories were absolutely furious, both at the king and his advisors, in particular, Suffolk. In 1450, a furious parliament summoned Suffolk and banished him from England. Only, as he was leaving, he was executed by angry nobles and his body washed up in Kent. Then, the ordinary folk of Kent fell prey to a rumour that the angry king was planning to take revenge by killing them and turning their whole county into hunting grounds. Because of that, and their less deluded fears of being invaded by the French king Charles VII, they rose up under a man called Jack Cade and marched on London. The 1450 rebellion was put down, but the whole country was now filled with unease. Into all of this stepped Richard, the Duke of York, a great-grandson of King Edward III, who throughout this period had been quietly running another part of the kingdom, Ireland, on the king's behalf. Given the 28-year-old Henry VI was still childless after 5 years of marriage, Richard just happened to also be the next in line to the throne, just in case, something were to happen to the king. York raised an army and entered London to help the king restore order, but this was seen as a direct threat to the king. York's offer of help was rejected. Instead, the king sided with one of the men responsible for many of the losses in France, the Duke of Somerset. But in 1451, things got even worse. Gascony, and its capital Bordeaux, part of the English crown since Eleanor of Aquitaine had married Henry II in 1152, fell to Charles VII. The news was so serious it caused Henry VI to have a mental breakdown. Henry fell into a catatonic state, unable to feed or clothe himself. The king couldn't even acknowledge the birth of his first child, Edward. We don't know the source of Henry's poor mental health, but it was possible he simply couldn't cope with the pressures of being king. In addition, his grandfather was of course Charles VI, who had also suffered very severe mental health issues, at one time becoming convinced he was made out of glass. Perhaps aware that the French king's illness had helped Henry V conquer most of France in the early part of the 1400s, English nobles decided they needed a strong leader. The Duke of York stepped up and was appointed protector of the realm. Queen Margaret, however, perceiving York as a direct threat to her newborn Edward's right to inherit the crown, opposed the appointment. But the nobles backed York, and unsurprisingly, Somerset was thrown in the Tower of London. But as quickly as Henry VI became ill, on Christmas Day 1454, he suddenly recovered, released Somerset, and stripped York of his power. A furious York became determined to separate the king and the Duke of Somerset. Raising an army, he met the Duke and the King at St Albans, where Somerset was killed and the King was accidentally injured by an arrow. The First Battle of St Albans in 1455 marked the start of the Wars of the Roses. The country was now divided down the middle. Those loyal to the king, or Lancastrians, and those who supported the Duke of York's cause, Yorkists. And all this was despite the king's almost comical efforts to get the two sides to make friends by organising a love day in 1458, an event which involved hated rivals being forced to walk through London, holding hands and pretending they were best of friends. Inevitably, more battles followed. In 1459, at the Battle of Blore Heath, York's forces defeated the king's army. Later that year, though, York's forces were defeated at the Battle of Ludford Bridge. In 1460, however, the king faced an army led by the Duke of York's powerful ally, the Earl of Warwick, at the Battle of Northampton. It was a disaster for the Lancastrians and the king. Henry VI himself was captured. York declared himself king, but after opposition from Parliament, it was agreed that he would only inherit the crown on Henry VI's death. Understandably, Queen Margaret was furious. Her 7-year-old son Edward was supposed to be the next king, not the Duke of York. The determined queen raised an army and marched north to face down the Duke. Amazingly, at the Battle of Wakefield, the tide turned completely. York's forces were defeated, and York himself was killed. His head was later hung from the walls of York City, with a paper crown nailed to it. It looked like the Yorkists were completely done for, especially after Warwick's defeat at the Second Battle of St Albans, during which poor King Henry VI was found sitting under a tree singing to himself. That could have been the end of it, were it not for the Duke of York's eldest. His 18-year-old son, Edward, who was now the new Duke of York. Determined to continue the war, Edward marched on London and had himself declared king. It was time for one last showdown. This time, the two armies met at Towton in Yorkshire. The Battle of Towton in 1461 is cited as one of the bloodiest of the era, with more than 10,000 men slaughtered. The young Duke of York's forces completely routed those of the king. Henry VI, the man who had ruled England for 39 years since he was a babe in arms, the king who had desperately wanted a peaceful life, was dethroned. The new Duke of York had himself crowned Edward IV later that year. Suddenly, Henry VI was a fugitive in his own kingdom, along with his wife Queen Margaret and their son Edward. For a few years, Henry was given sanctuary by a series of loyal nobles in the north of England. But by July 1465, he was captured and jailed in the Tower of London. This could have been the end of Henry VI. But that all changed thanks to a falling out between Edward IV and his main sponsor, the Earl of Warwick, which we'll explore in our next video about King Edward IV. In short though, by 1471, Edward IV was deposed by Warwick. Henry VI, now even more mentally ill thanks to his long years of captivity, was dragged out of the Tower of London and crowned king once more. 6 months later though, the deposed King Edward IV returned and defeated Warwick's forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Henry VI's son, Edward, the one-time heir to the throne, was killed, and poor Henry VI himself was recaptured. Not willing to risk allowing him to be crowned a third time, Henry VI was dead by the end of May 1471. Reportedly, he was bludgeoned to death by Edward IV's brother, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. We of course know Richard the Duke of Gloucester by another name. But more on him later. Henry VI was buried at Windsor Castle. In our next video, we will of course cover the life of his usurper, Edward IV.